Hi, everyone. Just wanted to welcome you to a video lecture today on the atemporal cinema or atemporal film. Ostensibly, we were going to be talking about Go, but because that's a hard film to find, many of you won't be able to see it. My hope is, though, that you'll be able to find many other examples of the atemporal cinema after the video lecture. In fact, my intention is at the end of the lecture to provide a list of possible films that you could use instead of watching Go. So that's the plan for today. It's going to be a relatively short lecture, just a video guide to the kinds of things that you can expect from the atemporal cinema. And yeah, and my hope is that we can make up for missed lectures by doing it this way. So I'll be posting this lecture tonight or tomorrow, on Wednesday, and then next week I'll post the other lecture. The other thing I should mention too is that I'm still trying to suss out what to do with the take-home exam, which film to ask you to write about, and so on. But for the meantime, let's just talk about atemporal cinema. So I'll go get changed and go lock myself in the safety of the Perry Estate bunker, and we'll from there we can see what we're going to do. All right. So I'll be right back. I'll see you in a minute. No, that is my toilet paper. Get away from it. Welcome back. We're now here in the fabulous Perry bunker here at the Perry Estates. This bunker was built by my great grandfather, Eduardo Professor Perry, known as Eduardo the Dim, mainly for things like building a bunker above ground and with windows. So, as you can see, the Perry intelligence extends back quite a ways. Today, what we're going to do then is talk about the atemporal film. And as I said in the introduction, ostensibly we were going to look at this in relation to the film Go. But Go is just one example among many of this idea of the atemporal film. So let's get into it. While watching any of the atemporal films that might be available to you or that you choose to replace Go, the things that I'd ask you to think about while watching the films, first off, I'd ask you to just think about the ways in which the films are structured in time. So, what is what we could call a temporal structure of the film that you're watching? How is the film organized? Does it move forward and backward in equal measure? Does it recap and revisit and so on? So, just think about that idea of a kind of temporal structure or even like a temporal architecture being put into play. Secondly, there's the way in which atemporal cinema creates a kind of subjective sense of time, as though we're experiencing time as it's experienced by the characters, and the subjective states of the characters are responsible for the movements forward and backward in time and so on. You could perhaps also think about this in relation to Henri Bergson and that idea of la durée, the flow of time, the experience of time. Third thing I'd ask you to think about is just whether or not this film that you've chosen as your atemporal film has any similarities to other films that we've looked at on the course. And you may find that not to be the case. I mean, I do think that films like Last Year at Marienbad, for example, are kind of pointing towards the atemporal cinema that we now associate with the latter part of the 20th and early part of the 21st centuries. But in any event, I'd ask you to think about similarities to earlier films and also perhaps differences from other films as well. Now, when we talk about atemporal film, what do we mean? I think it's pretty obvious that by atemporal we mean outside of time. So the atemporal film can be defined as a film which sort of exists or is considered outside time, without relation to time. So time as we understand it has no real bearing on the world, the fictional world of the film in the atemporal cinema. If you may remember going back to the very first and also video lecture, I talked about the idea of eternity as being, standing outside of time. And I think in some ways there's a connection there. So when we talk about atemporal film, what we mean then ultimately is films that kind of exist outside of chronological time. Chronological meaning, like literally the logic of time. So the sequence of time, a rational, logical, organized sense of time. Now, the film scholar Todd McGowan has this quotation, which I think is really quite useful when we think about the idea of atemporal cinema. McGowan says that, quote, the emergence of the digital era makes evident the pliability of time. So just to interrupt here, time becomes then something that we can mold, that we can stretch, that we can pummel into different shapes and so on. He goes on to say, through the use of digital technology, one can easily manipulate segments of time and disrupt traditional linear chronology. So what McGowan is really emphasizing here, I would suggest, is this sense of the emergence of the new digital technologies redefining how time can be used, and redefining in particular how filmmakers can use time. That time can be, in a sense, disrupted, that we don't have to rely on the kind of linear chronology that we expect to find in in mainstream cinema and in a lot of other cinemas as well. This is usually traced back, this kind of digitization of time, at least in terms of the cinema, is usually traced back to the introduction of offline video editing. It's usually traced back to around 1989 with the introduction of the Avid system. This is the Avid Media Composer, which was created for Mac and which was meant to be a digital way of editing and manipulating video. What was particularly important was that one could, using Avid, one could take segments of film and rearrange them the way that one does now with, say, Final Cut Pro or Adobe Premiere Pro or something like that. That one could take blocks of time in the form of filmed images and move them around and shift them around and so on. And that they could be treated like discrete pockets of time, so to speak, that could be shifted however one wanted. And what McGowan suggests is that the atemporal film is meant to be a kind of embracing of the idea of the spatialization of time. So if you think about looking at, say, Final Cut Pro, which this video has been edited on, you can take a segment of time and see it as a spatial object, as something that can be moved around within the space of the timeline in the video editing software. And so there's this kind of embracing of this idea that Bergson and others rejected, of the spatialization of time, the transformation of time into space rather than strictly temporality. What McGowan suggests as well, and I think this is particularly interesting and particularly useful for our purposes, is that the atemporal film relies on and explores the distinction between the idea of desire and the concept of drive. And that's what I wanted to talk about next. So the concept of drive and desire is traced back to Sigmund Freud, um, particularly his later work, which we'll talk about in a second, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And what Freud points out is that there is a distinct difference between drive and desire. Desire, he argues, attempts to regain the lost object. So there's that thing that we've lost. Let's say, for Freud, it would probably be something along the lines of reunion with the mother. We've lost our connection to our mothers. We've lost our direct, immediate connection to the mother as a source of love and nourishment and so on. Right? We're no longer united with the mother. So desire for that lost object, the connection to the mother, relies on the assumption that we can in fact regain that lost object, that it's something that can be found, that can be regained and reintroduced to our lives and so on. And by attaining that desire, we will achieve pleasure. We'll be satisfied. We'll feel this sense of fulfillment. By comparison, Freud argues that drive results from what he sees as the conflict between our biological instincts, our drive for pleasure, our drive for food, our drive for sex, our drive for intimacy, and so on. The conflict between those basic biological instincts and the restrictions and demands that the social order puts on us. And so we're unable to pursue the lost object, those biological instincts and imperatives, because society won't allow us to. I think this probably goes back in some ways to Freud's notion of the Oedipal complex and the sense that really what is being experienced is a drive towards some kind of connection to the mother that involves the Oedipal drive, and that we're not encouraged by the society or prevented by society from pursuing that, obviously, right? Now, Adrian Johnson says that, and I think this is a good way of distinguishing between drive and desire. He says drives come to enjoy the very failure to reach the impossible goal, whereas desire is permanently dissatisfied with the inaccessibility of its goal. So think about that. If I desire something, I'm constantly feeling dissatisfied because I'm unable to achieve that thing that I've lost, to regain that lost intimacy with the mother, for example. Whereas by comparison, what Johnson points out, and this goes back to Freud, is that drive, because it can't succeed, because it can't attain that which it's attempting to pursue or attempting to achieve, actually comes to derive a sense of pleasure from the failure to reach one's goal, to the failure to attain this impossible goal. And so satisfaction of the drive is believed to come from the repetition of the failure to regain the lost object, so that there's a kind of negative pleasure. I mean, when we enjoy not being able to attain the thing, the failure becomes the source of satisfaction for us, which sounds really kind of loopy. But then, Freud comes up with an example that I think kind of works really well to describe this. I should mention before going any further, though, that Freud has a really bad reputation now, as we know, for sexism, for classism, for misogyny, and for homophobia, and so on. But within the realm of cinema, Freud is still sort of seen as this key figure, and obviously, historically, he still ends up being one. But what Freud suggests is that this idea of repetition compulsion, And this comes from Beyond the Pleasure Principle from 1920. Freud looked at the behavior of infants, toddlers, babies, and so on, and began to wonder about certain actions that seemed to be putting the child at in a position of unhappiness, and yet they kept repeating that pattern, thus giving rise to this idea of drives. So here's the example that Freud comes up with. He talks about looking at his grandson, who is in the playpen and who watches his mother leave the room. And yet, like babies do, this baby's got toys in his playpen because babies have to be amused for some reason all the time. And the baby takes his toy and throws it out of the room, out of the playpen, just throws it on the ground. And then the toy is returned to the baby. And the baby discovers that by throwing this thing that he loves away, he can gain the satisfaction of having the toy returned to him. It gives the baby a sense of control over the world around him. If he throws the toy away, it will be returned. This is what Freud referred to as the Fort Da game. Fort meaning, I guess, here, and da meaning there. So the baby has the toy, Fort, throws it away, and it's da, and then it comes back, and so on. But my bad German aside, the crucial thing here is that sense of repetition and the compulsion to repeat as a way of gaining satisfaction of basic drives, and feeling a sense of control and a sense of power, because one is able to control the return of the object, right? So that's what Freud kind of focuses on. And at one point, Freud sort of suggests that repetition itself is neurosis, that neurosis is characterized by repetition. So you've I'm sure heard the expression that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And I think that's a good way of kind of summarizing this repetition compulsion. We keep doing the same thing, hoping for a different result, because that the failure of attaining that the goal of that drive is the thing that's most interesting or important to us. So what McGowan and others have suggested then is that this idea of the atemporal film engages in the expression of the drive by temporal repetition, temporal reordering, temporal fragmentation. So we kind of have the opportunity to feel that drive for the unattainable being expressed through repetition, through reforming, and so on. And what McGowan particularly points to, and I think this is really interesting as a way of looking at the atemporal cinema in its context of the late postmodern or post-postmodern world. What McGowan suggests is that the atemporal cinema is often and increasingly linked to the idea of trauma, of what we might call a sort of PTSD. So if any of you have seen the film Exotica by Adam Egoyan, although really any of Egoyan's films in the 80s and up to the end of the 1990s would work quite well. In Exotica, we have a narrative that is completely out of sync. We have movement all over the place in time with few cues as to where we're moving. So it's as though the film is outside of the temporal realm, and it's dealing with the death. Ultimately, we find out it's dealing with the death of a character, and that these are people who are kind of repeating various memories and repeating various actions and reforming those actions into different relationships and so on as a way of dealing with the trauma of this death. Obviously, many of you will have already seen Memento, the Christopher Nolan film from 2000, in which a character uh, suffers from severe amnesia, and the narrative of the film, as a kind of reflection of that trauma, breaks from temporal linearity, and so the story is told. No spoiler here. The story is told in reverse, right? An even better and more dramatic example of that, but also a film that I strongly encourage you not to watch, really not to watch. I'm begging you not to watch this film, is Gaspar Noé's Irreversible, in which the trauma of an extremely violent rape and the subsequent extreme violence of the attempted revenge for that rape, these things are presented to us in reverse chronology, much more rigorously reverse chronological order than what we find in Memento. Memento has a kind of narrative line that does seem to be moving in a linear progression, in a forward progression that kind of accompanies the reverse stuff. But in Irreversible, we just work our way back through the narrative, and it changes our experience of the film, and it makes it much more traumatic. Other possible sources or origins for this idea of the atemporal cinema are experimental films, and we looked at least parts of experimental films a couple of weeks ago, the Hollis Frampton films, for example. The film that I had intended to show and planned on showing this week was Maya Deren's Meshes of the Afternoon, which I know many of you have already seen. If you haven't seen it, I really, really strongly recommend that you take a look at it. It's pretty short. It's about 14 minutes long, I think, and it's readily available online. But it's a terrific example of a film that presents us with a narrative based on repetition and variation. And this repetition and variation deals with the idea of a traumatic event that the central character faces. Now, one other source, aside from experimental film and from the Freudian model of the drive and the desire, one other possible source or origin for the atemporal film is the work of is found in the work of Erwin Schrödinger, and I'm sure many of you have come across this before. But Schrödinger provides us with a thought experiment that has become really quite famous in quantum physics as an aspect of quantum physics. So what this model of reality, let's say, involves in the Schrödinger example is the famous story of Schrödinger's cat. Here's a diagram that's not particularly exciting, but that works, of the experiment. And it's a thought experiment. I have to point that out. So no cats were killed in the making of this presentation or the conducting of the experiment. So what Schrödinger, and again, this is connected to quantum physics and the rules governing motion and behavior on the infinitesimally small scale of quanta and particles. But what Schrödinger comes up with for this experiment is the idea of putting a cat in a box, and inside the box is a radioactive substance, a particle, radioactive particle with a particular half-life. And when that particle dies, when it reaches that half-life point, it will cause the breaking of a flask of a poisonous gas, which will then kill the cat. And what Schrödinger points out is that until we open the box, we can't really know if the particle has degenerated and the gas has been released and the cat has died. So we can't know if the cat is alive or dead until the moment when we open the box and take a look. Now, in part, this emphasizes the significance and the centrality of the experimenter and the observer on the outcome of the experiment. But it also raises an interesting possibility, because at some point before the opening of the box, Schrodinger argues, the cat is both alive and dead, or neither alive nor dead. But there's this sense that until that box is opened, we can't know what state exists, and therefore the cat is dead and alive until we open the box, right? Now, this I think is a really great thought experiment for a number of reasons. Because one, as I've said, it emphasizes the centrality of the observer, which I think is kind of useful for us as film students. As we're looking at films, we sometimes forget perhaps that these films are still in existence, but they only come into being really when we watch them, right? A film sitting on in a DVD case on a shelf exists, but it doesn't exist the same way that it exists when it's being watched by an observer, a spectator. So I think that's really interesting. But the other thing that's important here is that in this experiment, this thought experiment of Schrodinger's cat, the emphasis here is placed on possibility or probability. And so we're really waiting for that moment when we can open the box and all of the possible outcomes have suddenly resolved down to the one actual outcome. So all of the potentialities have become the one reality. But here's a really interesting twist on this, and I think that this is really the source of a lot of atemporal cinema today, and that's based on the work of Hugh Everett III. Hugh Everett III was an American physicist whose son, Mark Oliver Everett, is E from the band Eels. If you don't know Eels, you need to listen to Eels, especially Electroshock Blues, which is one of the most amazing, deeply depressing albums ever recorded. But what Hugh Everett III postulated came to be known as the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics. He published a paper about this in 1957. And what Everett suggests is that at the point when Schrodinger's box is opened, so remember, prior to the opening of the box, the cat is dead and alive, or neither dead nor alive, but it's the opening of the box that makes the truth revealed, and that makes the truth happen, or the reality happen. What Everett suggests is at that moment when we open the box, the world bifurcates, that reality splits, and there's one world in which the cat is dead, and there's another world in which the cat is alive. And these separate realities constitute different worlds, the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics. And so one of the things that I think we see in films like Sliding Doors, for example, with Gwyneth Paltrow, everybody's favorite, if you haven't seen that film, it basically follows a woman as she's about to get on a train or subway. And in one reality, she misses the train, and in the other reality, she catches the train. And the outcome of that moment points to two different worlds, and we get to see those. Or you could think perhaps about a film like The Butterfly Effect, in which a character is able to have an impact on the outcome of events, again, in this kind of many worlds version of things. Probably the best example of atemporal film, other than Go, probably the best example of the atemporal film would be a film like Run Lola Run, which features a narrative that is based on repetition, but repetition with variation, and is again linked to this idea of trauma. So again, this emphasizes the idea that time is possibility, that time is potentiality, and that once we reach that singular moment of the present, all of those potentialities collapse. These infinite potentialities collapse down to the singularity of this moment. So those are the things that I was hoping that we would get a chance to talk about in relation to the atemporal film. I've already given you a few films that you could think about for an alternative to Go if you're unable to find Go. So one would be The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind is a good example of atemporal cinema, a film that revisits and revisits the past and is clearly very subjective in its handling of it. We could also think of Sliding Doors as another example. Anything by Adam McGoyan from the 1990s in particular, so Exotica, The Sweet Hereafter, which is about the crash of a school bus and provides some really interesting things about time in there. Exotica, Sweet Hereafter, The Adjuster, another film that Egoyan made that might be really useful in this respect. Run Lola Run, which is an excellent example of the atemporal film. And if I can think of any others, I'll post them on CoreSpace's announcements just to kind of flesh things out for you and give you an option or other options to look at. This development in film, I think, is a really interesting one because on the one hand, it's emphasizing the incredible diversity of temporal realities that films could deal with. But secondly, and this is going back to what McGowan says, I like the idea of this being linked to trauma, as though cinema is a way of working through trauma and disaster and catastrophe, but also as a way of working through the anxieties of living in this digital age, an age in which reality is quite often shifted and manipulated. Photographs used to be seen as being the truth. Pictures don't lie, right? Well, now we're at this point where reality can be manipulated quite easily and quite convincingly. Things like deep fakes, for example, and so on, which are kind of existing outside of time altogether. So these are the things that I'd like you to keep in mind while watching whichever atemporal film you decide to check out. And I hope that this has been helpful in some regard, at least, in sort of guiding you towards ways of approaching the topic. Now, I have to say that I'm very sorry that we're not going to get to see each other for these next 2 weeks and for the week of what would have been the screening of the take-home exam film. But I hope you're all taking care of yourselves and taking care of each other, and that you're washing your hands. Make sure you wash your hands. So I will be back next week with another installment of video lectures. I'm going to be, I think I've mentioned this on CoreSpaces already, but I will be conducting my office hours as regularly, as they are regularly held. So Wednesday noon till roughly 2 o'clock. Ideally by email, but if push comes to shove, I'm okay with doing it by Skype as well. So if you need to contact me during office hours, please, feel free to do so via the internet. Anyway, stay home, stay healthy, stay safe, and eat more cheese.